Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with Trump waging war against half of America as he targets cities and states controlled by Democrats, while also waging war against our closest allies by attacking NATO, handing over Ukraine to his buddy Putin, and emboldening tyrants and kleptocrats around the world. Joining us to discuss the Caligula moment of the megalomaniacal madman in the Oval Office is Sasha Abramsky, who writes regularly for The Nation. He is the author of several books, including Breadline USA, American Furies, The American Way of Poverty, and Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against the Far-Right Takeover of Small-Town America. His latest book out this week is American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and Doge Butchered the U.S. Government. And we will discuss his latest article in his weekly column, Authoritarian Watch at The Nation, The Week of Colonial Fever Dreams from a Sundowning Fascist. Then we'll discuss the latest report from Oxfam ahead of the annual Billionaire Bash at Davos and speak with Rebecca Riddell, the Senior Policy Lead for Economic and Racial Justice at Oxfam America, an international human rights lawyer with a background in addressing extreme inequality and excess corporate power and promoting economic and social rights. She served as a senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, carrying out investigations and advising governments on policies related to tax, social spending, and other areas. She is a contributor to the new report at Oxfam, Resisting the Rule of the Rich, Defending Freedom Against Billionaire Power. Then finally we'll investigate corruption inside DHS and ICE after the Republicans gave the thugs waging war against their fellow Americans $170 billion, and speak with Justin Elliott, a reporter with ProPublica, where he covers business and economics as well as money and influence in politics. He's produced stories for the New York Times and National Public Radio, and he won the 2015 Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. We'll discuss his article at ProPublica, Firm Tied to Kristi Noem Secretly Got Money from 220 million DHS ad contracts. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now, Sasha Abramsky, who writes regularly for The Nation. His latest book out this week is American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and Doge Butchered the United States Government. And his latest article in his weekly Authoritarian Watch column at The Nation is The Week of Colonial Fever Dreams from a Sundowning Fascist. Welcome to Background Briefing, Sasha Abramsky.
Good to be on the show, Ian. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the height of absurdity, except that it's deadly serious because Trump is threatening to invade Greenland, and he's basically, the real agenda, as far as I can see, is to destroy NATO. But the National Security Council sent the text that he sent to the Norwegian Prime Minister to all of the embassies in Washington, D.C., and basically he says, Dear Jonas, that's the Prime Minister of Norway, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus. I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. And then he goes on to talk about how he wants to take Greenland. I mean, this is beyond belief. It is tragic, it's comic, it's absurd, but it's
Well, it would be comic and it would be absurd, except it's deadly serious. It's absolutely deadly serious, because what this illiterate, increasingly senescent old man is saying is, you didn't give me a prize for peace, and therefore I'm going to wage war. And I'm not just going to wage war on, some far-off place. I'm going to wage war on the most core allies the United States has, its NATO allies and its European friends. Now, let's put this in context. These are people who have been on America's side, marching side by side, in pursuit of democracy and human rights as ideals since World War II. And Trump is coming in, and he is doing what Putin has failed to do, which is shatter the Western alliance and basically replace it with a rule of the strongest, a rule of the jungle. And the idea that Trump would blackmail the entire European Union plus Britain and say, unless you let me invade your territory, I'm going to try and shatter your economies. I mean, this is so surreal. It's beyond surreal. And, you read this message that he sent to the Norwegian Prime Minister, leaving aside the fact that the Norwegian government has nothing to do with the distribution of the Nobel Peace Prize. The letter could have been written by a schoolyard bully who had missed several English language classes, the ones that had to do with grammar, the ones that had to do with syntax, and had clearly failed every civics class. I mean, the idea that you would threaten an entire continent because you have a fit of pique that you didn't get a prize and didn't get a medal, it is beyond surreal. We're now in 25th Amendment territory, because we clearly are being governed by a leader who has become a megalomaniac. And if there is any meaning to the 25th Amendment, that meaning is that when a president loses his marbles, when a president is completely incapable of fulfilling his constitutional duty, his cabinet has a duty to remove him. Now, they won't. It's absolutely clear. He's surrounded by sycophants who will do whatever he tells them to do. But he is taking the country and he is taking the Western Alliance down the road of ruin. It is deadly, deadly serious.
And not only has he written this extraordinary note to the Norwegian Prime Minister, he has threatened sanctions, 10% on the main NATO countries, and he's going to ramp up those sanctions on June the 1st unless they cry uncle to 25%. So he's backing up this threat with economic warfare. And of course, the real agenda, as far as I can see, is to destroy NATO. And
he's creating a situation where NATO will be a dead letter, because as soon as the most powerful country in NATO essentially wages war on the other members, or threatens to, unless they abide by his way or the highway, the concept of NATO is dead. So what you basically have is a European Union plus Britain that's facing a pincer movement between an authoritarian Russia and an authoritarian United States. And that is a completely deadly concept for Europe, especially for Western Europe.
Isn't it the end of Ukraine, though? Isn't he getting Putin off the hook in Ukraine by essentially...
Absolutely. Because what he's saying is the concept, look, for 4 years now, the Western Alliance has said you can't do what you're doing in the Ukraine because it breaks international rules, it breaks the international order, it flouts human rights, it flouts concepts of sovereignty. So as soon as America does the exact same thing against one of its own erstwhile allies, the rationale for supporting Ukraine disintegrates. And you see this week, this Board of Peace, this sort of nebulous organization that Trump's trying to create as a replacement mechanism for the United Nations. He's offering countries a seat on the quote-unquote Board of Peace in exchange for $1 billion. It's a shakedown operation. But one of the countries and one of the country's leaders he's now offered a seat on the Board of Peace is Putin and Russia. This is an absolute absurdity to have a sort of international organization designed to act either as a competitor with or a replacement for the United Nations, to offer membership to the highest bidders and to then include, at this moment in time, Vladimir Putin. You couldn't get a clearer statement that America is turning its back on the concept of the international order and the concept of a rules-based, human rights-based system. And the consequences are going to be felt for decades. What Trump is doing now, out of pique, and out of, as he admitted, a psychological obsession with ownership. What Trump is doing now is going to shatter the international order for decades. And it's going to create a situation where there is one rolling war and one rolling conflict after the next, after the next, after the next. It's sabotage, all in pursuit of this sort of increasingly megalomaniac vision that Trump has. And you're seeing this not just internationally, but you're seeing it domestically. You look at the conflict that's brewing now in Minneapolis. I mean, this is unprecedented. The idea that a United States government would literally order the occupation of a city because he doesn't agree with their liberal politics. It's unprecedented and it should not stand. And, you know, I really think we're 1 year into this Trump experiment, this Trump 2.0, and we're seeing exactly how destructive this experiment is, what it's doing both to the American project and what it's doing to the international order. And on every level, it is destructive. It's a wrecking ball aimed at stability and aimed at peace. And I think, you know, a year in, people who are still hooking their political fortunes to Trump really need to look in the mirror, and they need to look at what they are creating and what legacy they are leaving for future generations. And it is across the board a legacy of destruction.
So if this man is destroying the world to please Putin for whatever reason, how many people do you think in the government get this, that know, they must know? This is a man that clearly he has no friends, nobody likes him. He's a horrible human being, yet he wields such power and terror over these supine Republicans. And the Democrats do not seem to understand what you're talking about, Sasha. They don't seem to understand how dire this is. This is, as you point out.
People are beginning. I think political leaders, not just in the Democratic Party, but I think across the board now, if you ask political leaders in private, they're beginning to get what a dangerous situation this is. But look, this ties into the book that I'm releasing this week on the war on the federal civil service. You know, we think of DOGE as this sort of standalone chapter, this chapter of brutality at the beginning of the Trump administration, where hundreds of thousands of workers were summarily fired, their health insurance was canceled, many of them were literally frog-marched out of their places of work by armed U.S. Marshals. We think of this as this sort of chaotic, sadistic thing that Trump and Musk unleashed, and then it was over. But the thing is, it's not over. Because if you declare that the federal bureaucracy and independent professionalized civil servants are the enemy of the people, and you fire or drive out of government 1 in 10 or 1 in 8 of the federal workers, what you're doing is you're creating a workplace culture of fear and of terror. And all of the other workers in that civil service will be so terrified of losing their jobs that they will do whatever you ask them to do. So this idea that you break down the federal bureaucracy and that was a standalone thing, it's just not right. You break down the federal bureaucracy, and then all the other parts of the authoritarian project become more possible. Because when you make it clear to federal workers their jobs are insecure, their pensions are insecure, their health insurance is insecure, you install a culture of fear. And those workers are far more likely at the back end of the day to acquiesce in the propaganda and acquiesce in the cruelty and acquiesce in all of the sadism that is a core part of the Trump's project. And so I think you have to understand this past year, you have to understand the DOGE activities in this much larger context. And that's what I'm talking about in my book, American Carnage, is this notion that what we are witnessing is a full-on assault on the democratic culture and foundations of this country. And part of that assault involves tearing apart the federal agencies and the federal civil service that would have been capable of reining in Trump's worst impulses.
So, Sasha, just in the last couple of minutes then, given that the 25th Amendment has to be triggered by the Vice President and the rest of the Cabinet have to agree, how do you see this working out? If indeed enough Republicans realize, in senior positions, realize that we're in a crisis here with a madman in the White House who has his finger on the nuclear button, and if the Democrats, finally recognize the clear and present danger of Donald Trump, instead of complaining about him and using him as a way to get elected, saying that, we're not so great, but this other guy is really bad. I mean, come on, this is a 5-alarm fire.
It's a 6-alarm fire. I mean, it is so far beyond the 5-alarm fire at this point. It's like when you talk about Spinal Tap and they talk about going up to volume 11 on the amplifier. We are at volume 11 at this point. There is no chance that Vance is going to trigger the 25th Amendment. There is no chance that Pete Hegseth or Kristi Noem or Pam Bondi or any of these other lickspittles are going to trigger the 25th Amendment. It is inconceivable. Trump has conquered the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is basically at his feet as he enacts this increasingly literally mad agenda. The only way we are going to get beyond this is a massive, massive public reaction. And I'm not the only one saying this. I mean, there are conservative commentators like David Brooks on the New York Times who are now saying that this country needs an enormous groundswell from the bottom up of citizens saying enough is enough. Because unless people realize the severity of the crisis American democracy is facing, this country is going to slide not just into autocracy, it's going to slide into absolute cronyism, absolute corruption, and it is going to be governed by the diktat of an increasingly mad, increasingly untethered Donald Trump. Now, we have 3 more years until the next election. Even if we make the assumption, which at this point is a leap of faith, that that election will be conducted fairly, even if we make the assumption that at the end of the day, Trump won't call out the military or do any of the other things he's threatened to do to control and to manipulate and to undermine the election, even if we assume all of that, there is no guarantee that this country's democracy survives 3 more years of Trump's wrecking ball politics. And this is what, I'm writing Authoritarian Watch. This is my column where I'm interviewing experts, political philosophers, legal advocates, journalists, people who have studied other countries as they slid into authoritarianism. This column is charting what happens when the braking mechanism on a president with authoritarian ambitions ceases to function. When all of the braking mechanisms that commentators 4 or 6 or 8 years ago thought would rein in the Trumpian moment, the Supreme Court, Congress, the governors, all of those braking mechanisms start to fail. And what we're seeing is, without a public resistance, this country is particularly vulnerable to takeover by authoritarians. And so when you sort of look at what's happening in Minneapolis this week, this is not just a local struggle. It's a fight for the soul of America. Because if Minneapolis goes down, if ICE and all these other armed agents are allowed to run roughshod over one of America's great cities, then that is an extraordinarily destructive message. And it gives Trump carte blanche to go into any other city he wants to do the same thing. So anyone of good conscience, anyone who cares about democracy in this country, anyone who cares about human rights and dignity in this country has a dog in the fight in Minneapolis. Make no mistake about this. What happens in Minneapolis is a precursor to what could happen in city after city after city in Trump's America over the coming years.
Sasha Abramsky, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Ian, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Sasha Abramsky, who writes regularly for The Nation and is the author of several books, including Breadline USA, American Furies, The American Way of Poverty, and Chaos Comes Calling, The Battle Against the Far-Right Takeover of Small-Town America. His latest book out this week is American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and Doge Butchered the United States Government. And his latest article in his weekly column at The Nation, Authoritarian Watch, is The Week of Colonial Fever Dreams from a Sundowning Fascist. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back discussing the latest report from Oxfam ahead of the annual Billionaire Bash at Davos, resisting the rule of the rich, defending freedom against billionaire power.
Handful of senators don't pass legislation, and marches alone can't bring integration. When human respect is disintegrating, this whole crazy world is just too frustrating. And you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Rebecca Riddell, who's a senior policy lead for economic and racial justice at Oxfam America, an international human rights lawyer with a background in addressing extreme inequality and excess corporate power and promoting economic and social rights. She served as a senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, carrying out investigations and advising governments on policies relating to tax, social spending, and other areas. She's a contributor to the new report at Oxfam, Resisting the Rule of the Rich, Defending Freedom Against Billionaire Power. Welcome to Background Briefing, Rebecca Riddell.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my great pleasure. I so appreciate the work you do, and it's just really a nice thing to be here to talk to you today.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And your new report finds that there's a record number of billionaires created last year with a collective wealth of $18.3 trillion, and that the number of billionaires surpassed 3,000 for the first time during 2025. And since 2020, their collective wealth has grown 81%, which is enough to eradicate global poverty 26 times over. So in other words, the increase in wealth of global billionaires is enough to eradicate global poverty 26 times over. Is that right?
Yeah, it is pretty shocking. So I should start off by saying, every year, right, Oxfam puts out a global inequality report just as the 1% or the 0.1% are kicking off the convening of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. And, so every year, we talk about what's going on with billionaire wealth globally. But I have to say, this past year, despite a lot of economic turmoil, billionaire wealth rose an astronomical amount, 3 times faster last year than it had in the previous 5 years, to its highest point in human history. Right now, we're looking at a situation where the world's 12 richest billionaires have more wealth than half the world. 1 in 4 people globally face hunger. Here in the US, we've seen a really astronomical boom for billionaires alongside what is really an affordability catastrophe for working families. Were last year's trends to repeat, 2026 could even give rise to the first trillionaire. And that stat that you shared about, the fact that you could eliminate extreme poverty many times over just with what billionaires earned last year, I think really goes to the heart of it. It's a pretty disturbing picture.
But it's not just that they have the money, it's that they're deploying their money politically, right? And that they're taking over. What you point out, the research estimates that billionaires were 4,000 times more likely than an ordinary person to hold political office. And while more than half of the world's media companies and 9 of the top 10 social media platforms are owned by billionaires. And one of the richest people in the world, often referred to as the richest person in the world, Elon Musk, he, in the last election, essentially bought the victory for the Republican Party and helped Donald Trump immensely with about $300 million. And he's doing the same thing this time around.
Yeah. So this year, it's unfortunately a very timely topic, but we've chosen to focus on the really deep link between extreme economic inequality, something we write about a lot, but that link between extreme economic inequality and political inequality. So as our report shows, the rise of oligarchic power is one of the fundamental challenges to democracy itself today. We see a trend of booming wealth for the few, but also of freedom really being crushed for the many. And these aren't separate issues, but they're intertwined. In the US, but in countries around the world, we see it up close as, powerful corporations and the ultra wealthiest individuals have not just captured markets, but politics and the public square. And there's the really startling stat you shared about just how much more likely a billionaire is to hold office than a regular person, than you or than I. And I think people, they may think, okay, a billionaire could buy a private jet or they can buy a big house. But I think most people would agree it's a really different thing altogether to buy a politician or a judge or newspaper. Another startling finding is that just 100 billionaire families gave $1 in every $6 spent by US candidates, parties, and committees in the 2024 election cycle. There's also new research out there that shows how Supreme Court justices are increasingly voting for the wealthy. So, this isn't just about the outsized power of that 0.1%. It's about what the effects of that are, right? It's about how power is used to really protect and enlarge the wealth of the 0.1%, but also too often to repress people. And that's a really important finding that we also see in the streets today in the US and around the world.
Well, not only did Elon Musk buy the last election for Donald Trump and the Republicans, and he's buying it now for the midterms. He's starting to spend money, and he's mended his, mended the breach with Trump. But what I find more alarming, since I'm in the media, is the extent to which billionaires, already Musk owns Twitter, now X, which is very influential politically. And now you have another one of the richest men in the world, Larry Ellison, and his son. They've already bought CBS News, and many people in the journalistic community feel that they're in the process of absolutely destroying it. But they also are now entering a hostile takeover of Warner Brothers in order to capture CNN. And apparently Larry Ellison has already promised Donald Trump that he will get rid of a couple of the anchors at CNN that Trump doesn't like. So, my God, this is all happening. We can see it, that they're buying up the media, not just the politics, but the influence is extraordinary. And of course, I'm not even mentioning Rupert Murdoch.
Yeah, it's something that is disturbing is just the range of ways in which billionaires have been able to use their really significant wealth in order to capture significant power, right? And so whether that's through, purchase of institutions, media institutions, and otherwise, which allows them a platform to then, put out messages that sort of reinforce a desirable political narrative, or it's simply, being able to give to candidates or even seeking office themselves. There's just so many avenues through which the very wealthiest have been able to access political power in ways that simply aren't available to regular people. I don't have a problem with a billionaire having the same political power as me, but that's not what we're seeing today, right? We're seeing billionaires who have political power correlated with their wealth, and that's not right.
So since, Rebecca, since Oxfam releases its annual report on the eve of Davos, so where you have a bunch of the world's richest people and their political hirelings, etc., and a lot of friendly media, sitting in hot tubs, drinking Dom Perignon and wringing their hands about the fate of the world. What I find interesting about this year's report, which is Resisting the Rule of the Rich, Defending Freedom Against Billionaire Power, is that there is pushback going on. And many people identify Mamdani's becoming the mayor of New York as an example. But also there are other examples around the world which I'd like to talk about with you. For example, in Nepal, where young people literally rose up because they were just fed up with the limited horizons for their future. The same thing is here with our Gen Z in America. Many of them are already saddled with a lifetime of debt from college degrees, and they can't get a job. Many are living at home, and in many cases, they've ended up, in these private colleges have given them a worthless diploma and a lifetime of debt. So walk us through some of the pushback that's going on, not just here in the United States with Mamdani, but I think in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and in Nepal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pull back and say, I think something that really puts this into context is there's a really great study that we cite in here that it's a study of over 2,000 protests in 101 countries over decades, and it found that economic justice was the second largest driver of dissent when they looked at protests. And that really speaks to just how much these issues, kitchen table issues, the world over are felt, and they get people in the streets, from here in the US, where we've seen folks come out in support of taxing the rich and the New York Mayor Mamdani's agenda, as well as against a really bad tax bill, to around the world. As you said, we lead and open this report with a really strong foreword from the Secretary General of Amnesty International. And I think that also speaks to the really strong links between economic justice and our civil and political rights. You can't have one without the other, really. And we highlight in the report some of the inspiring stories of folks who are on the front lines in the fight against inequality. One of those people is an activist from Kenya, Tom, And he joined protests in 2025 against a really unfair tax bill that would have just put a huge burden on low-income households. And he ended up being the victim of an attack by police officers. He had rubber bullets shot at him. But he was okay eventually, and the protest forced the president to withdraw the bill. And Tom told Oxfam, if the protests were tomorrow, I'd go again. We're fighting for a better Kenya. If we don't do it now, who else will? And he is one example of so many types of ways that people can be a part of this fight today. It doesn't always look like protesting, right? There are all kinds of ways people are showing up in community to support each other. That can be sharing food, providing unpaid care. There's a range of different ways, but I think I really appreciate the opportunity you're giving me here to highlight that work.
So let's talk a little about what happened recently in Nepal when the government was brought down by Gen Z protesters, and one of their targets was Binod Chaudhary, which is Nepal's only billionaire, a member of parliament, and his businesses and properties were burned down. So that is somewhat unexpected, right? We don't often hear about Nepal. And it was pretty clear, wasn't it, that this was driven by very young people. This is Gen Z, which is their ages between 18 and 29.
Yes, it has been incredibly inspiring to see Gen Z protests around the world this year as young people have really stepped up. They have indicated that they are not going to put up with the status quo that is really clearly not working both for them and for the planet. And there are so many movements around the world where we've seen young people get in the streets, young people make demands that their human rights should be fulfilled, and that policymakers really need to listen.
Well, here in the United States, though, we probably have one of the most, if not the most, billionaire-friendly government, certainly in the history of the United States, as far as I can tell. Because just at the inauguration of Donald Trump, which was indoors because of the weather, we all saw all of these tech tycoons and others standing around behind Trump, with Mark Zuckerberg, Lawrence Sanchez, Jeff Bezos, Sundar Pichai, Elon Musk, etc. So am I correct in suggesting, Rebecca, that this is probably the Trump administration, probably the most billionaire friendly? Are there any other countries around the world that have more billionaires, being feted and made prominent? And of course, these same billionaires are all going to buy or pay for this ballroom that he's going to build, having torn down the east wing of the White House.
I'd go a step further and say it's probably the most trillionaire-friendly administration I can think of. Since Donald Trump took office this about a year ago, the Trump administration, with the support of Congress, it's really carried out an incredibly pro-billionaire agenda. They've initiated the largest transfer of wealth upwards in decades through their so-called One Big Beautiful Bill. They've carried out the single largest act of union busting in U.S. history. They've decimated programs, really important programs that many millions of people rely on to access healthcare and food. And at the same time, the very richest are doing better than ever. A few months ago, we tallied up what the 10 richest U.S. billionaires had gained in 12 months. It was nearly $700 billion, just 10 men alone. And overall, the top wealthiest 0.1% of the US, they own 24% of the stock market right now. It's at its record highest in recent decades. So we are certainly looking at an administration that is, at risk of driving US inequality to new heights.
Well, but the president in waiting, if you will, which is the vice president, J.D. Vance, he was the beneficiary of $15 million from one tech billionaire, Peter Thiel, who essentially bought him a Senate seat and then went down to Mar-a-Lago to lobby Trump to take J.D. Vance on as a vice president. So it's not inconceivable, Rebecca, that the next administration, if J.D. Vance were to become the next president, would be even more in the pocket of billionaires, particularly the tech billionaires from Silicon Valley.
Before reaching, I suppose, I guess my answer would be, I don't know if we're there yet. We're at a critical juncture, and I think it will be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years in the country and in the world. there's a really clear link between economic inequality and democratic backsliding. And I can tell you about the evidence that unequal countries are, 7 times more likely to experience democratic erosion than more equal countries. I can tell you about the peer-reviewed studies, but also you can just look in the newspaper, right? It doesn't feel like rocket science to make the connection between economic inequality and democratic backsliding. But also people care right now. They're waking up, they're in the streets. And I think that there's a growing awareness that shoring up democracy and rebalancing power is going to require really tackling inequality. And this has been recognized and addressed before in U.S. history. Supreme Court Justice Brandeis decades ago is credited with saying, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And that choice is being felt today. And so I think we can expect to see people making more demands of policymakers to really focus on radically reducing economic inequality, on curbing the outsized power of the super rich, and on really building up the political power of the many.
Well, Rebecca Riddell, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
It has been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.
And again, I've been speaking with Rebecca Riddell, who's a senior policy lead for economic and racial justice at Oxfam America, an international human rights lawyer with a background in addressing extreme inequality, excess corporate power, and promoting economic and social rights. She served as a senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, carrying out investigations and advising governments on policies related to tax, social spending, and other areas. And she is a contributor to the new report at Oxfam, Resisting the Rule of the Rich, Defending Freedom Against Billionaire Power. We're going to take a brief station break and back investigating corruption inside DHS and ICE after the Republicans gave the thugs waging war against their fellow Americans $170 billion.
That gold and silver will melt away. I'd rather be in a deep, dark grave and know that my poor soul was saved than to live in this world in a house of gold.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Justin Elliott, a reporter with ProPublica, where he covers business and economics as well as money and influence in politics. He has produced stories for the New York Times and National Public Radio, and he won the 2015 Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. And he has an article at ProPublica, Firm Tied to Kristi Noem Secretly Got Money from $220 million DHS ad contracts. Welcome to Background Briefing, Justin Elliott.
Good to be here.
So thanks for joining us. And we are at an extraordinary time in this country where essentially half of the country has been targeted by essentially what is Donald Trump's private army, ICE. They've thrown huge amounts of money at them. They are not a normal law enforcement operation that's there to protect and serve the public, but rather they are harassing, terrorizing, and even killing members of the public. And they have targeted a Democratic city run by a Democratic mayor in a state run by a Democratic governor who happened to be on the ticket that Trump ran against in 2024. So there's an undeniable political component to this. So how did we get to a point, Justin, where we, the taxpayers, are paying for people to harass and even kill us?
Yeah, I mean, there's, DHS frankly had a pretty healthy budget before this administration, but the big watershed during the Trump administration, of course, was the so-called Big Beautiful Bill that passed last year that granted DHS, I believe, on the order of more than $150 billion. So
170
billion. Yeah. And a lot of that money, the federal bureaucracy still moves relatively slowly. So that's money that's not, certainly has not all been spent, is going to be spent over a number of years. But we certainly are seeing a surge of spending. The story that I wrote that you mentioned was focused on one of the first things that they did out of the gate, which was spending more than $200 million on this kind of unprecedented immigration-focused ad campaign.
That featured Kristi Noem in one of her many costumes, but in spite of the Republicans touting family values, the reality is that DHS is run by Corey Lewandowski, who is the boyfriend of Kristi Noem, who happens to be married. So there's a certain tackiness to all of this, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't focused on there's widespread reports that Kristi Noem and Corey Lewandowski, at least at some point, were in some sort of relationship, which they've denied. But I think from a kind of good government perspective, the more interesting aspect of that relationship is that Corey Lewandowski holds a very unusual role at the Department of Homeland Security, which is I've been talking to dozens of people in and around DHS, and everyone describes Lewandowski as essentially the chief of staff to Kristi Noem, very powerful chief of staff. But the unusual aspect of the arrangement is that he's actually technically not a government employee. He has come aboard DHS as what is called a special government employee, which is this category where you don't actually get a salary from the government agency. It's sort of volunteer work. But as a result of that, you don't have to make public financial disclosures, whereas, for a normal government official, a journalist like me could go and look at your, sources of income, assets, that sort of thing. We can't do that with Corey Lewandowski. And importantly, he's also permitted to actually have outside income. So Lewandowski may be working for we don't know who, at the same time as, being the second most powerful person at this incredibly powerful government agency. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about that setup. People might have heard of this in the context of Elon Musk, because last year Elon Musk was also in this special government employee category where he was working for the government, but not, in an official, or not as a kind of official paid employee.
Right, and he's one of the few people, Corey Lewandowski, that can literally walk into the Oval Office. He's got a very close relationship with Trump, as does Stephen Miller, who's some people suggest is the co-president. But both Noem and Lewandowski have, prior to this outrageous killing of this Christian woman in Minneapolis, who was shot, it turns out now she was shot 4 times, once in the face and twice in the chest and once in the arm. Prior to that, they had their goons tackle and wrestle to the ground a United States senator here in Los Angeles, inside the federal building, which you cannot get into unless you've gone through metal detectors. So the senator was not posing any threat to Kristi Noem. He just simply wanted to ask her a question at a press conference she was conducting, but he was brutally treated by these goons. So if they can do that to an American senator, at the time, that was outrageous enough. But now they could kill an American citizen and give the killer immunity. These people are out of control.
I mean, I think the Noem's role is, it was certainly striking to me, and I haven't been directly covering what's happening in Minneapolis, but it was striking to me that Noem, out of the gate, during a press conference down near the border in Texas, said that what was going on was an example of, I think she used the phrase domestic terrorism, and that was obviously certainly before there had been any investigation or anything like that. So it is, I think what we're seeing with the way that Noem is running this agency is certainly unprecedented in a lot of ways.
And we mentioned earlier the $170 billion that DHS and ICE got through the big, beautiful bill. $45 billion of that is earmarked for private prisons, largely 2 private prisons, Geo Group and Core Civic. They have they have ties to Tom Homan, the border czar, who got $50,000 in cash in an FBI sting, which apparently is not returned, as far as we know. So there you've got another example of an out-of-control agency. And on top of the 45 billion that's going to go to these prisons, and we don't know how much money's trickling down, we certainly have reasons to be a little suspicious of Tom Homan in terms of his credibility and honesty. But there's also another 30 billion targeted or earmarked for bonuses and recruitment. So they already, ICE is a bigger army with a bigger budget than the United States Marine Corps.
Interesting. I did not know that particular factoid, but I mean, I think there has not been enough attention paid to the money aspect of this, which is what, a colleague of mine and I at ProPublica are full-time reporting on DHS and money, because I think the bill, again, the so-called big beautiful bill passed through Congress and signed by President Trump last year, that's where a lot of this new money is flowing from. And I think that is, has already reshaped the government in significant ways. And I think, most of that money is not out the door in terms of there's a lot of money pouring towards border wall construction. You mentioned there's presumably going to be a lot of money flowing towards construction of camps by companies like Geo and CoreCivic. And so what we're trying to do is sort of follow the money in the traditional investigative reporting sense.
Well, let's talk about what you've uncovered here with the firm tied to Kristi Noem that secretly got money from the $220 million DHS ad contracts. We know, certainly, we've heard a lot from Tricia McLaughlin, who's the chief spokesman for the DHS, because she's been the sort of liar in chief. Every time ICE does something terrible, she gives you an alternative reality. And in this case, they've been blaming the victim, who was recently murdered by the ICE officer Jonathan Ross in Minneapolis. It turns out that her husband is, well, what's his association with the strategy group, the people that get the money to make the ads?
So what happened here is, early on in the Trump administration last year, one of the first things that happened at DHS was they put out these more than $200 million contracts for this ad campaign. Some people might have seen these ads. Some of them have Kristi Noem kind of like talking to the camera. Some of them have Kristi Noem on horseback with Mount Rushmore in the background, and she's basically saying like, illegal immigrants go home type of message. And this is a fairly extraordinary thing. It's a quite significant amount of money for an ad campaign, more than $200 million of public money for an ad campaign. But it was very, it caught our attention from the beginning, because the main recipient of this money was a Delaware LLC that had been created just a few days before getting this absolutely massive government contract. So just an entirely new entity that had never existed before, and certainly wasn't like a actual company that does ad buying with a staff and a website and all of that sort of thing. So we started looking into it, and what we found is that secretly, not listed on any of the contracting documents, not known to the public, one of the firms that is actually doing the work for these Kristi Noem ads is a firm called the Strategy Group out of Ohio. And that firm is run by the husband of the chief DHS spokeswoman, Tricia McLaughlin, who you mentioned, she's all over the press whenever one of these episodes of violence happens. And what we were told by, government contracting experts is this raises quite significant questions around how did this government money make its way to the husband of the head of public affairs at DHS. And the Office of Public Affairs at DHS was actually the office dealing with this advertising contract. And so we don't know the answer to that. I mean, DHS told us that there was no wrongdoing here, but they didn't really engage on the details. And so there's still a lot of questions about how did Tricia McLaughlin's husband's firm get this contract, and also who else is getting the money from this contract, because we think there may be more more non-public subcontractors here, and we would like to know who they are.
And what do we know about the Delaware company, Safe America Media?
So this was another kind of thing that caught our attention about this is if you look it up, you know, you can't get much from the state of Delaware about corporations that are created there. That's kind of what the state of Delaware is for. But you do get an address. And when you look at the address of this firm, it's actually just a residential home in Virginia outside of Washington, D.C., owned by a veteran Republican operative who does advertising work. But frankly, we still don't really know who is doing most of that work because this Delaware LLC, again, is not a real company. It doesn't have a real office. It's based at this residential house, you know, handling a $200+ million ad contract, takes a certain number of people to make the ads, you know, deal with the TV stations. Some of this is happening internationally. These ads are actually running also in Mexico and some other places south of the United States. And so we were able to figure out the connection to Tricia McLaughlin's husband only through kind of shoe leather reporting, because DHS isn't answering questions about this, but we think there's more here.
And what do we know about Sheehan, who's the second in command of ICE? She received money from Yoho, the husband of Tricia McLaughlin, through his company. I believe now, didn't she just announce that she's running for the Congress in Ohio?
Yes, this is Madison Sheehan, who's not a household name, but somebody who's very important in Kristi Noem's orbit. She was essentially Kristi Noem's sort of body woman, like the person that would give her Diet Coke when she wanted one. Back when Kristi Noem was governor of South Dakota. Madison Sheehan's very young. She's in her late 20s. I think she's 28 or 29 now. And she rose very quickly from being Kristi Noem's personal aide to actually being the #2 deputy head of ICE, which is a huge job, as you could imagine. She didn't have any real law enforcement experience to speak of. And what we found in the reporting for this story was that Madison Sheehan actually previously had financial ties to this company, the strategy group that got part of the ad contract. She'd previously been paid by them for some work in South Dakota. And so, another example of the kind of financial ties between Kristi Noem's people and this firm. And, the way government contracting is supposed to work is you don't get to just give government contracts to your friends and allies if you're a politician. There's a whole, extensive set of rules and regulations around fair competition, and open bidding and this sort of thing. And so, the government contracting experts we spoke to said the fact that this firm ended up being one of the ones doing the work here and getting the public money raises all sorts of questions about whether those rules were followed.
Well, when we talk about the ads, though, Justin, that Kristi Noem did out of this $220 million ad buy that benefited the husband of the DHS spokesman, Tricia McLaughlin, it wasn't just that she was talking about we're securing our borders. She also said we're defending and protecting our culture, which is, I don't think there's any other way to interpret that except that it's completely racist. Isn't she referring to the idea that we want a white America, we don't want a brown America?
I mean, look, certainly we've seen, what was in her heart with those particular comments, I obviously can't say, but we have seen the social media coming out of DHS, I think has been pointed out by a lot of people, has been explicitly along those lines, like pictures of kind of white pioneer type families, images like that evoke the 19th century with messages like, take back what's ours, that sort of thing. So yes, it's the messaging coming out of DHS, I would say, is not subtle.
So just in the last couple of minutes then, Justin, in terms of giving our audience some sense that, they're already being terrorized, people are afraid, particularly, families are being broken up. Anybody's being picked up. In a lot of American citizens are picked up. In fact, we don't even know whether most of the people they round up end up being American citizens. There was an incident just the other day in Minneapolis where they grabbed a guy out of the car, and the wife was pleading with the officers. You can see it on camera, saying, "Please don't shoot my husband. I need my husband to take care of the kids." The idea that we've come to that point is so shocking. But it seems to me that there's some evidence that the American people just are not going to tolerate this. I've seen evidence, for example, that companies, hotels, restaurants, etc., are putting up signs saying we will not serve ICE. So is there a way, do you think, for citizens in this country to object to the idea that they're paying for a bunch of thugs to terrorize them and possibly even shoot them?
To me, obviously, how this administration responds to public opinion, I wouldn't bet on that one way or the other. It's very, very hard to predict how these things will play out. But I think the interesting thing to watch is Congress. Just this week we saw articles of impeachment drafted, by Democrats. So of course, they don't control the House or Senate right now. But articles of impeachment to impeach Kristi Noem drafted and actually cited our reporting on SAD contract among other issues, including the ICE violence. So I think Congress's oversight role is going to be the key thing to watch. Whether Congress plays a kind of robust oversight role under its current control, I think we don't know. But we've seen surprises out of Congress even in the last few weeks, where not all Republicans in Congress are in lockstep with the Trump administration on issues like Venezuela, for example. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. I think if the Democrats take the House this year and take the majority next year, as a reporter, that really changes. The prospect of an opposition party, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, doing oversight on the White House, that can really change the game because suddenly you have government officials being called in for hearings. You have the House, using its subpoena power to investigate things that come out in the press. So that's what I'm focusing on. In the meantime, we're doing our best, my colleague and I, ProPublica, to follow the money at DHS. And by the way, if anyone out there has any knowledge of any kind of DHS contracting or money issues that we should be aware of, please reach out to me. My email address is on all my stories at ProPublica.
Well, just in closing, Justin, it's as well as the impeachment of Kristi Noem being put forth in the Congress, there's also a bill put forth to defund ICE. And Democrats are no longer afraid of the taint of defunding the police. It seems like they're quite confident that the public is behind defunding ICE, and I think there's some polls that indicate that.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at another government shutdown fight happening, I believe in the next few weeks, and every time we have one of those, budgetary issues are up for negotiation, and the latest reporting is that some Democrats are asking for reforms being made to ICE and DHS as in exchange for supporting a funding bill. I think obviously what exactly that looks like, whether it has any teeth, whether it gets through, those are all very, very open questions. But I think, if you're looking for kind of countervailing power on the executive branch, I think the place where it theoretically exists is the legislative branch. And I think that's what I'm watching this year to see if anything changes.
Well, Justin Elliott, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much.
And again, I've been speaking with Justin Elliott, who's a reporter with ProPublica, where he covers business and economics, as well as money and influence in politics. He's produced stories for the New York Times and National Public Radio, and he won the 2015 Investigative Reporters and Editors Award. And he has an article at ProPublica, firm tied to Kristi Noem secretly got money from the $220 million DHS ad contracts. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.